The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above the ER at Mercy General, a sound like electricity trapped in glass tubes. Megan O'Brien moved through the chaos with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned, long ago, that being noticed was dangerous. 8 months she'd been here in Houston. 8 months of double shifts, of volunteering for the worst patients, of keeping her head down and her past locked in a locker on the 3rd floor. The coffee stain on her left scrub sleeve was from 4:37 a.m., when she'd spilled an entire cup while stabilizing a trauma patient's arm for the anesthesiologist. She hadn't bothered to change. Changing meant going to the locker. Going to the locker meant being alone with the boots. Her hands moved with a precision that didn't match her appearance. Grey hair pulled into a bun. 47 years old. A face that had learned not to smile. When she inserted the 18 gauge for into Mrs. Chen's arm during the morning rounds, the needle went in on the first try, the catheter seated perfectly, no fumbling, no second attempts. The young resident watching, Dr. Patel, maybe 28, 3 months out of med school, blinked. "How did you do that so fast?" Megan didn't answer. She just taped the line, checked the flow, and moved to the next patient without a word. That was the rule she'd made for herself, competence without explanation. Do the work. Don't draw attention. Disappear. The ER that morning was running at 70% capacity, which in Houston meant controlled chaos. 7 patients in beds. 4 waiting in the lobby. 2 in the hallway on stretchers because the beds were full. A 73-year-old with chest pain in Bay 2. A construction worker with a lacerated forearm in Bay 4. A child with suspected appendicitis waiting for imaging. Megan had already drawn labs on 5 of them, inserted 2 4s, and helped stabilize a diabetic patient whose blood sugar was 43. Her station at the nursing desk was organized, charts stacked by urgency, medications queued on a tray, her handwriting on the whiteboard clean and precise. Dr. Sterling arrived at 6:48 a.m., 12 minutes after shift change. His white coat was immaculate. His tie matched his cufflinks. His reputation preceded him like a cologne that couldn't be ignored, 12 years at Mercy General, family connections to 3 board members, a golf handicap that was apparently more important than his patient outcomes. He moved through the ER the way some men moved through everything, expecting the world to part for him. The nurses parted. They always did. He noticed Megan when she was inserting a central line. The patient was a 56-year-old male, pneumonia progressing to sepsis, and the peripheral access wasn't holding enough volume for the fluids he needed. Dr. Sterling had ordered the central line 40 minutes ago. He then disappeared to the physician's lounge, where, according to the nursing staff, he spent more time than anywhere else. When he returned, he found Megan standing over the patient with a 14-gauge needle, prepping the subclavian site with chlorhexidine, her movements economical and sure. 2 residents were watching from the corner, Dr. Patel again, and another one, Dr. Marcus, who looked nervous. "I'll take it from here," Sterling said. "Lines in," Megan replied. She was already securing the dressing, checking the ultrasound confirmation, noting the placement on the patient's chart. The line was in, perfectly positioned, no complications, no fumbling. She had done it in less than 4 minutes. The resident's eyes widened slightly. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened. You could see it happen, a small movement, the muscle working beneath the skin. He looked at the line. He looked at Megan. He looked back at the line. When he spoke, his voice was pleasant, almost conversational. "Thank you, nurse." But his eyes said something different. They said, "I saw what you can do, and I don't like it." Megan didn't respond. She simply documented the procedure, checked the flow one more time, and moved on to the next patient. That was mistake number 1, not making herself small enough. Not making herself invisible enough. By 9:15 a.m., the humming light seemed to lean down closer, watching. The nursing station was crowded, 12 staff members working the morning shift, pharmacy techs, unit secretaries, 2 residents. Megan was standing at the desk, updating Mrs. Chen's chart, when Dr. Sterling approached. He was holding her patient charts. 3 of them. He set them down hard, the slap of folders against the desk sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of the ER. These notations, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, are sloppy. Megan looked at the charts. They were meticulous. Timestamps. Vital signs. Assessment notes. Everything documented in her careful, precise handwriting. "I'm going to give you a week," Sterling continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had never been questioned. "1 week to either get your act together or get your resignation on my desk. I have a feeling you won't make it past day 3. He smiled then, a smile that was supposed to make her small, supposed to make her doubt herself, supposed to crack something open inside her that she'd spent 8 months holding closed. The room went very quiet. Not the silence of respect. The silence of people watching to see how someone would break. Megan's hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. But something happened in her chest, a pressure building like air trapped in a closed space. She let one tear escape, just one, sliding down her cheek without breaking her composure, and she wiped it away without looking away from Sterling's eyes. When she spoke, her voice came out steady as a surgical laser, each word distinct and measured. "You'd better hope you never need me when it counts." The room stayed quiet. Sterling's smile faltered, just for a moment. He wasn't expecting that kind of response. He was expecting capitulation. He was expecting fear. Instead, he'd gotten something else entirely, something with the weight of a promise and the texture of a threat. He turned and walked away, but not before his shoulders stiffened slightly, a small acknowledgement that something in the dynamic had shifted. Megan returned to her charts. At 11:32 a.m., Sterling appeared in the cafeteria where she was eating a salad she didn't taste. She was sitting alone in the corner, the way she always did when he passed by her table. He was carrying a tray with a sandwich, a bag of chips, and a bottle of water. When he reached her station, he stopped. He looked at her. Then he knocked her tray to the floor, the bowl, the dressing, the roll, all of it scattered across the tile in a small explosion of salad and croutons. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness. Around them, a handful of residents who'd been eating stopped mid-bite. Someone smirked. Someone else looked down at their plate, embarrassed. Megan didn't move. She just sat there for 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3 breaths. Then she stood. She grabbed paper towels from the dispenser. She kneeled down and began, methodically, to clean up the mess. Her movements were slow and deliberate, not rushed, not panicked. She was in control of her own humiliation, which somehow made it worse for Sterling, because she wasn't actually humiliated. She was just cleaning up a mess, the way you'd clean up anything in a hospital, without emotion, without shame. One of the residents, Dr. Patel, started to stand, to help, but Megan gave him the smallest shake of her head. "No. Just watch. Just understand what kind of man this is." She finished cleaning. She stood up. She dumped the paper towels in the biohazard waste. And then she looked at Sterling with eyes that had seen things he would never understand, experiences he would never survive. In those eyes was the calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world had to offer. "Thank you, Doctor," she said quietly. Sterling left the cafeteria. Behind him, the residents sat in stunned silence, and one of them, Dr. Marcus, made a small note in his pocket. The kind of note that would matter later. Megan returned to her station at 12:15 p.m., where the afternoon shift was beginning. She went to her locker during her break, opening it just wide enough to see the boots, Army Ranger issue, worn paracord instead of laces, the leather cracked from 12 years of desert heat and mountain cold. She touched the leather once, just for a moment. Then she closed the locker and went back to work. She had no idea that at that exact moment, an Army Ranger named Corporal Martinez was being loaded into an ambulance in North Houston, his chest wrapped in field dressings, his breath coming in shallow gasps, the shrapnel wounds from Marja still burning like memories that wouldn't die. She had no idea he was coming. The ambulance doors burst open at 14:19, and Megan heard it before she saw anything: the squeal of brakes, the paramedics shouting vitals, the stretcher wheels locking into place on the trauma bay tile with a metallic thunk that echoed through the ER like a starting gun. She was halfway through checking an 4-line on an elderly patient when the sound pulled her attention toward Trauma Bay 3, where the ER doors had already swung wide and 2 paramedics were transferring a young man in mud-stained BDUs onto the hospital gurney. The patient couldn't have been more than 25. His chest was wrapped in field dressings, the kind applied in the field, soaked through with blood that had already begun to dry at the edges. His boots were tied to the gurney with paracord, the exact military knot, the kind that could be undone in 3 seconds flat with one sharp pull. Megan's hands went still. The laces were wrapped in the same figure-8 pattern she had wrapped them 2 decades ago in a burning village 9,000 miles away. The leather was worn to the same soft grey. The sole was scuffed in the same spots. She didn't move. Couldn't move. The room around her seemed to tilt slightly, and she gripped the forestand beside her, her knuckles whitening against the cold aluminum. The patient's face was turned away, obscured by the oxygen mask the paramedics had secured, but it didn't matter. Those boots were a language she had forgotten she still spoke. Those boots meant Marja. Those boots meant a child Smallfoot she had guided into leather twice his size, telling him in Pashto that he would grow into them, that they would keep him safe, that she would find him when it was time. Senior Chief. A resident was standing beside her, confusion crossing his young face. You okay? You're pale. Megan blinked. Released her grip on the forestand. Her hands felt numb, the way they did after holding a trauma shears for too long. I'm fine, she said quietly. What's the patient status? But Dr. Sterling was already moving, his voice cutting across the ER like a scalpel. Shrapnel wounds, IED blast radius, Marja, approximately 4 hours ago. Multiple penetrating injuries to the thoracic cavity. Get me a 12-lead EKG stat. I want CT imaging on this immediately. He snapped on latex gloves with the practiced aggression of a man who enjoyed the sound they made, that distinctive snap-snap that meant authority, that meant this was his domain now. I'm taking primary on this case. Megan watched from the corner of the bay, her body moving on automatic pilot, oxygen running, monitor leads being placed, the resident starting a second full line. But her eye stayed on those boots. Always on those boots. The memory was a door she had spent 20 years keeping locked, and those boots were the key turning in the lock. A small boy, maybe 5 years old, dark eyes wide with terror as the village burned behind them. She had picked him up, felt the weight of him against her chest, felt his heart hammering like a trapped bird against her ribs. His name was Wazer. She had whispered it back to him over and over as she ran toward the extraction point, as the Black Hawk rotors beat the smoke-thick air, as his small fingers had dug into her collar. Then the handoff to another operative, the moment when she couldn't hold him anymore because it was time to go, time to disappear into the dust and the dark. Had he survived that day? She had told herself not to know the answer. Told herself that knowing would destroy the careful structure of this invisible life she'd built, these 8 months at Mercy General, these coffee-stained scrubs, this grey bun and this carefully constructed nursing history that no one had thought to question too closely. Megan. Sterling's voice snapped her back. I need you on the surgical consent forms. And get Dr. Chen from cardiothoracic down here immediately. This level of penetrating trauma requires specialist evaluation, and I want it documented that I ordered a consultation within 4 minutes of arrival. It wasn't a request. It was a command buried in procedural language, and they both knew it. She nodded once and turned toward the administrative station, her movements precise, controlled, each step deliberate. But her mind was in the gurney, in the boots, in the burning village and the terrified child's name she was not allowed to remember. The next 20 minutes unfolded like a choreographed dance that Megan had performed 1,000 times, consent forms filled with information she only half processed, insurance verification, blood work ordered, imaging scheduled. She could do this in her sleep. She had done this in places where the power came from generators and the sterile field was whatever flat surface didn't have bullet holes. But Sterling kept her moving, kept reassigning her to other trauma bays, kept inserting himself between her and the patient with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. "Megan, we need you on the ruptured appendix in Bay 1. Move quickly." Sterling didn't look at her when he said it, didn't acknowledge that she'd just finished the consent forms for Corporal Martinez, the young ranger who had no one else at the hospital, no family listed in emergency contacts. "Dr. Patel is waiting for your assistance." She didn't argue. That wasn't her way. Compliance was a tool, and she wielded it with the same precision she wielded a 14-gauge needle. Obedience was a disguise that had kept her alive for 2 decades, and she wasn't going to abandon it now, even as something deep in her chest, something buried and armored and carefully starved, was beginning to wake up. The appendectomy was straightforward. Routine. Her hands moved through the scrub nurse role with mechanical efficiency, accounting sponges, passing instruments at the precise moment Dr. Patel's hand opened, anticipating each move before he made it. The smell of antiseptic was sharp and clean, 1,000 times more chemical than the dust and blood of the field, but her nervous system didn't care. To her body, the surgery was surgery. The OR lights hummed their fluorescent song, and somewhere across the hospital in Trauma Bay 3, those boots were still tied to a gurney, and that boy, that small, terrified boy, was maybe still alive, maybe still breathing, maybe still waiting for someone to remember him. She finished the procedure at 15:23. Sutured the surgical site with Dr. Patel's nod of professional approval. He was competent, at least, even if he wasn't Sterling. She helped transfer the patient to recovery, documented the times in the system, and then she did what she had trained herself to do for 20 years. She stood still in the hallway for exactly 4 seconds, pressed her palm against a cold stainless steel equipment cart, and let her breathing return to baseline. Pain was data. Panic was information that could be processed and filed and dealt with later, in the dark, alone. But Sterling was waiting for her when she stepped out of the recovery room. His shadow fell across her first, his presence making the air pressure change in a way that reminded her of standing downwind from a man who was about to do something dangerous. "Glad to see you're capable of basic competence on routine cases," he said, his voice carrying the kind of false warmth that was actually a blade wrapped in velvet. "I'm reassigning your next 3 trauma consults. You're on observation duty only. Shadow Dr. Martinez from cardiothoracic, you can observe, but you won't be providing direct care." "Understood, doctor." Her voice was steady. Obedient. The voice of a woman who was exactly what she pretended to be. What Sterling didn't know, what no one at Mercy General knew, was that she could already calculate what a penetrating thoracic injury with multiple shrapnel fragments would require. Needle decompression, probably, if a tension pneumothorax developed. Immediate access to a surgical suite. Blood products. The kind of crisis that separated the living from the dying in a window of minutes, sometimes seconds. The kind of crisis where a senior chief petty officer who had run field triage in the Hindu Kush would know exactly what to do, even if she was supposed to be just another middle-aged nurse with a bun and fading scrubs. She watched Sterling disappear back into Trauma Bay 3, watched him through the glass as he pulled up the CT images on the monitor, watched his jaw tighten as he studied the scans, the kind of tightening that meant the injuries were worse than initial assessment suggested. Shrapnel didn't follow neat patterns. It fragmented, ricocheted, created cavitation wounds that looked different on imaging than they did to the naked eye. She had seen it before. She had treated it before. She had held the wounded while waiting for extraction, had applied tourniquets with her teeth when both hands were already holding someone's life together. And then the intercom crackled to life, and a voice that wasn't hers called out across the ER like a distant bell, "All available surgical staff, report to administration. Dr. Sterling is needed in the director's office immediately." He was gone within minutes, leaving Corporal Martinez in the hands of a cardiothoracic fellow who was competent but overworked, a resident who was still learning, and a nursing staff that suddenly had one less set of hands. The boots remained tied to the gurney. The patient remained breathing, barely. The memory remained locked in a box that was beginning to rust open at the seams. Megan moved to the supply station and began reorganizing inventory that didn't need reorganizing, her hands moving through the motions of someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. She could wait. She had waited 2 decades. She could wait a few more hours for Sterling's games to play out, for whatever conversation was happening in that office to conclude, for the next move to reveal itself. What she didn't know, not yet, was that Sterling had already made 4 phone calls. 1 to the hospital board president. 1 to the licensing board. 1 to an external HR investigator. 1 to a contact at the state medical board who owed him a favor from a golf game 3 years ago. By the time Megan clocked out of her shift, the trap would already be set. By the time Trauma Bay 3 flatlined, Sterling's version of her would already be circulating through channels she couldn't reach. By the time Corporal Martinez needed her, she would already be gone. The monitor flatlined at 14:51. One long, thin shriek of a tone that entered the room of every sound except its own accusation. Martinez's chest had stopped rising 3 breaths ago, the kind of small thing that kills you if nobody notices. The kind of small thing that everyone notices too late. Tension pneumothorax. The words didn't need to be spoken aloud because every person in Trauma Bay 3 could read them in the sudden collapse of his left lung, in the way his oxygen saturation had plummeted from 94 to 71 in the span of 30 seconds, in the way his blood pressure had gone slack like a puppet with cut strings. Air had entered the space between his lung and his chest wall with the shrapnel wound and then kept coming, kept accumulating, kept pressing against his heart with the slow crushing weight of a stone. Dr. Sterling stood frozen at the crash cart, his hands suspended over the defibrillator paddles like a man who had suddenly forgotten what hands were for. His mouth was open. His eyes were wide and fixed on Martinez with the expression of someone watching a life slip away and realizing, with absolute clarity, that he had no idea how to stop it. The charge nurse looked to him. The resident looked to him. The respiratory therapist's fingers hovered over the ventilator settings, waiting for an order that wasn't coming. Seconds evaporated. 1. 2. 3. Megan moved. She didn't think about the HR investigator waiting in the hallway with a folder of questions. She didn't think about the employment discrepancies or the university calls or Sterling's emails to the state board. Muscle memory was older than fear. It was older than survival. It was older than the part of her that had learned to disappear 8 months ago. She shoved past Sterling, not hard enough to knock him down, but hard enough that he stumbled backward, his chest hitting the counter with an audible thud. She was at Martinez's side before anyone could process what was happening. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her fingers found the landmarks by memory, by the 1,000 times her hands had done this exact thing in a desert compound and a forward operating base and a medevac helicopter that smelled like diesel and blood. The 14-gauge needle was in her hand. The hiss. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. The sound of air escaping under pressure, the sound of a lung re-expanding, the sound of a young man's body remembering how to live. The monitor's tone changed, flatline became rhythm. Sinus rhythm. 1 beat. 2. The oxygen saturation climbed like it was crawling up a wall, 71, 79, 86, 92. Martinez gasped. His eyes opened. Not the eyes of a man coming back from the edge of death, the eyes of a man who was alive because someone had decided that death would have to wait. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's soft mechanical breathing, a sound like air through a tunnel, like the world had paused and was holding its own breath to see what would happen next. Dr. Sterling's face had turned the color of arterial blood. Not red, crimson. The kind of color that meant humiliation had moved past embarrassment into something else entirely. Something that would root itself into his bones and live there. Megan didn't look at him. She was already moving to the monitor, checking the line placement, calling out Martinez's vitals to the charge nurse in the clipped, authoritative voice of someone who had spent 20 years giving orders that men's lives depended on. Oxygen saturation stable at 94. Heart rate 108. We need a chest X-ray before he goes to OR. Page trauma surgery. Tell them he's prepped and ready to move in 10 minutes. It wasn't a request. The charge nurse was already moving, already making calls. The resident nodded and stepped to the side, not because he had been told to, but because he could see exactly what Megan was, the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. The kind of presence that made the air pressure change. Sterling was still standing against the counter where she had left him, his hands now at his sides, his mouth still open like a man trying to speak words that wouldn't come. But that wasn't the worst part for him. The worst part was that everyone in the trauma bay had seen it. The resident had seen it. The charge nurse had seen it. The respiratory therapist had seen it. The medical students observing from the corner had seen a nurse that Sterling had publicly labeled unstable, incompetent, a liability, perform a life-saving procedure with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. They had seen him freeze. They had seen her move. They had seen the difference. In the hallway outside, the HR investigator was still waiting with her folder, but nobody was paying attention to her anymore. The story that would travel through Mercy General by shift change wouldn't be about employment discrepancies or altered credentials. It would be about the nurse in the trauma bay. It would be about the moment when everything everyone thought they knew about the quiet woman in the coffee-stained scrubs had proven to be a carefully constructed lie. Megan's hands moved with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to saving lives with instruments and nerves, not words. She stayed in Trauma Bay 3 for another 8 minutes, until Martinez was stable enough to move, until the trauma surgery team had arrived and assessed him themselves and given her a nod of acknowledgement, the kind of nod that one professional gives to another when hierarchy dissolves and competence becomes the only language that matters. Then she stepped back and let them take him. Sterling was no longer at the counter. She caught a glimpse of him disappearing down the corridor toward his office, his phone already in his hand, his face still that impossible shade of crimson. She knew what he was doing. She could hear him in her mind, already making calls, already activating his network, already trying to find a way to turn this moment from a professional embarrassment into evidence of something worse. Emotional instability. Insubordination. A nurse operating outside her scope of practice without proper authorization. The charge nurse approached her as she was washing her hands at the sink, the water running over her knuckles, carrying away the memory of latex and medication and another man's death that had almost been. That was. The charge nurse started, then stopped. What was that? Tension pneumothorax, Megan said quietly. He needed a needle decompression. No. I mean, Sterling was supposed to handle it. You moved. Megan didn't answer. She dried her hands on the paper towel dispenser, and the sound it made was like a small mechanical heartbeat. You need to go home, the charge nurse said. Something's happening. I don't know what, but Sterling's been making phone calls all morning. There's someone from corporate HR waiting by the staff break room. I heard her ask the reception desk about your personnel file. Megan had already known. She had felt it the way an animal feels a storm coming, the pressure change in the air, the way the light shifted, the way everything had been moving toward this moment since the day Dr. Sterling had knocked her lunch tray to the floor. She nodded once and moved toward her locker, where the worn combat boot still sat in darkness, waiting. The rain had started outside, hammering against the ER bay doors like applause for a performance that nobody had asked for. Within the hour, Dr. Sterling moved like a man possessed by panic dressed as authority. His hands trembled as he scrolled through his phone in the administrative office, rainwater still dripping from his designer coat onto the marble floor. The board president, Margaret Chen, was at her daughter's wedding in Austin when his call lit up her screen at 19:02 hours. She almost didn't answer. Margaret, this is Dr. Sterling from Mercy General. His voice was smooth now, rehearsed. I hate to interrupt the celebration, but we have a credential crisis in our ER. A nurse, Megan O'Brien, has been operating under false references. She nearly caused a catastrophic error today with the Ranger case. The lie was crafted perfectly. Not entirely untrue, just weaponized. Margaret listened while string quartet music played in the background of her daughter's reception. By the time she hung up, she'd already made 3 calls of her own. Sterling's next move was surgical. He contacted the fake references Megan had carefully constructed 8 months ago, the references that didn't exist, the phone numbers that routed to disconnected lines, the employment history that was air and wishful thinking. When the investigators called those numbers, they got silence. Then nothing. The paper trail vanished like smoke, and the absence of verification was itself the indictment. At 19:45 hours, an external HR investigator named David Bancroft arrived at Mercy General with a leather briefcase and the kind of expression that suggested he'd destroyed career trajectories before breakfast. He was already combing through her employment records, her direct deposit information, her time cards. 8 months of careful invisibility was about to become 8 months of suspicious documentation. He found the gaps in her timeline. She'd listed military service in vague terms, cited a personal leave that spanned nearly 2 decades, provided references that couldn't be reached. On paper, Megan O'Brien looked like a ghost who decided to haunt a hospital. Sterling watched from a distance as security was called. He watched as they escorted Megan from the building at 20:34 hours, her badge already deactivated, her access stripped. The termination letter was printed on official letterhead, credential discrepancies and insubordination. It was handed to her in the hallway outside the break room, where 3 nurses stopped mid-conversation to stare. One of them was the resident Megan had trained in her first week, the one who'd asked her questions about anatomy and gotten answers that were always exactly right. Megan didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply returned to her locker, changed out of her scrubs, and pulled on the rain jacket she kept on the hook. The worn combat boots were still there in the darkness at the bottom, the boots she'd kept hidden from view, from conversation, from any glance that might ask questions. She held them for a moment, their leather cracked and weathered, the laces still tied in the way she'd learned to tie them in 2003. Then she put them in her bag. The drive to Houston National Cemetery took 40 minutes through hammering rain that sounded like artillery on the windshield. Route 90 east, through the city where she'd tried to disappear, where she'd worn her invisibility like armor and thought it might actually work. The rain intensified as she drove, each drop hitting the glass with the force of accusation. Marcus's grave was in Section D, Plot 247. She'd been there only twice since the funeral 6 years ago, both times alone, both times at night. The grass was sodden now, mud oozing between the stone markers, the granite headstone slick with rain that reflected nothing back at her. She collapsed onto the mud-soaked grass, her knees giving out the way they never did in the hospital. The rain soaked through her jeans, through her underwear, into the bone itself. "I failed, Marcus." Her voice broke on the second word. The rain kept falling. "I tried to disappear like you told me to. I tried to be nobody. I tried to be just a nurse with grey hair and coffee stains and no history. But I can't stop being who I was, and now I've got nothing left." The headstone didn't answer. It never did. Marcus had been a 160th SAW pilot, night stalker, and he'd spent their last conversation before deployment telling her to walk away, to stop carrying other people's trauma, to let someone else be the hero. "You've already given enough," he'd said. "Give yourself something." Then his Black Hawk went down over Kandahar province, and she'd spent the next 4 years extracting that mission anyway, pulling Marines from burning villages because the pain was cleaner than the silence. She stayed there for an hour, her scrubs still visible beneath her rain jacket, soaked and clinging to her skin. The cemetery was empty except for the sound of water running through drainage ditches and the distant hum of traffic on 90. Lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the rows of identical white headstones, each one representing someone's Marcus. Someone's moment when the world broke and never quite put itself back together. Her phone had buzzed 3 times during the drive. She hadn't checked it. Whatever messages waited in her dark apartment could wait longer. Whatever was coming next, and something was coming, she could feel it the way she used to feel incoming helicopter rotors, could wait until morning. But it wouldn't. At 2,147 hours, as Megan sat in the darkness of her apartment on Westheimer Road, her phone rang. Not a text. Not a notification. An actual call with a number she didn't recognize. The area code was 202. Washington, D.C. She let it go to voicemail. The phone buzzed again 30 seconds later with the same number. Then again. 3 times. On the 4th ring, she answered. Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien. The voice was male, professional, carrying the particular timbre of someone accustomed to giving orders that were never questioned. I'm Navy Captain James Halloway, NCIS liaison to the White House. We need you to understand something very clearly. What happened at Mercy General today is already in motion. You need to prepare yourself. You have 72 hours before this becomes public. Then the line went dead. She stared at the phone in her dark apartment, the rain still hammering the windows, and understood that her invisibility had an expiration date that had just been announced. The next morning, she returned to Mercy General under police escort, not as punishment, but as protocol, as a way to collect her belongings without Sterling or his network interfering. The rain had stopped, leaving the parking lot slick and gleaming, the sky the color of old concrete. Officer Mitchell walked beside her, his badge catching the gray light, his hand resting casually on his belt. The ER was already full when they entered. Code Blues didn't wait for convenient timing. A trauma was incoming, another routine catastrophe in the machinery of emergency medicine. Nurses moved with the practiced precision Megan had learned in the first week, that muscle memory dance that didn't require consciousness. She walked past them toward the locker room, the worn combat boots heavy in her bag like stones. That's when Martinez called her name. Reaper. His voice was raw, still damaged from intubation tubes, but his eyes were clear and locked directly onto hers with a recognition that erased 2 decades in a single moment. He was sitting up in the recovery bed near the observation window, his 4 lines still running, his monitor beeping its steady rhythm. That's her. That's the operator. The room didn't go silent. The room was already loud, monitors and alarms and the perpetual noise of an emergency department functioning at full volume. But something shifted in the sound itself, a frequency change, like all the individual noises suddenly resolved into a single frequency of collective realization. Megan stopped walking. Officer Mitchell stopped beside her, his hand moving away from his belt because he understood, in the way combat veterans always understand, that something had changed irrevocably. A man in dress blues entered from the administrative hallway, a navy uniform, captain's bars, the particular bearing of someone who'd given orders that ended lives and saved them in equal measure. Behind him came 2 more officers, an Army colonel and an Air Force general. They moved toward Megan with the kind of purpose that made the remaining ER staff unconsciously step backward, creating space like cells parting in a bloodstream. The Navy captain handed her a folder. Not manila. Not standard issue. Classified markings on the cover, red stamps, clearance levels, deployment rosters that had no business existing in an open ER. Her hands shook as she opened it. Yemen. Somalia. Hindu Kush. 8 deployments. 43 combat extractions. 16 personnel recovered under active fire. The dates, the locations, the call signs of teams she'd worked with, all of it rendered in official language that made everything sound simultaneously more and less real than the actual experience. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien. The Navy captain's voice cut through the ER like a blade. 3 bronze stars. 2 purple hearts. Martinez pulled himself higher in the hospital bed, ignoring the 4 lines pulling taut. She pulled me from a burning village when I was 5. She tied my boots so I could walk. The Army colonel stepped forward. His voice was steady, ceremonial, the way officers spoke when they were reading citations. Navy Cross for extracting 12 Marines under enemy fire in Marja while critically wounded herself. The Air Force general added the final detail, the one that would end Sterling's career before it finished collapsing under its own weight. Call sign Reaper. Voluntary separation 2 years ago for medical reasons. PTSD protocol. She walked away to protect the people around her. And you tried to destroy her for saving your life. The last sentence wasn't directed at Megan. It was aimed at Dr. Sterling, who stood frozen near the medication dispensary, his face the color of old paper, his mouth opening and closing without sound emerging. The charge nurse's hand flew to her mouth. A resident dropped his tablet, the sound sharp as a gunshot against the floor. Officer Mitchell was speaking quietly into his radio. Outside, rain began falling again, softer this time, tapping against the ER bay doors with the rhythm of someone asking permission to enter. Megan stood in the center of the emergency department, the classified file in her hands, the worn combat boots still in her bag, and understood that anonymity was over. The warrior was home whether she wanted to be or not. 3 hours after security escorted her from Mercy General, Megan sat in her dark apartment with the termination letter folded on her lap. The discharge papers lay scattered across the coffee table like autumn leaves. She'd stopped crying somewhere around the second hour. The apartment was silent except for the distant hum of traffic on Interstate 45, 8 stories below. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Area code 202. Washington. She stared at it. Let it ring. The call dropped. Then immediately rang again. Same number. She still didn't answer. Some truths, once acknowledged, couldn't be taken back. By the next morning, she'd convinced herself the call was a wrong number, a telemarketer with perfect timing. But when she pulled into Mercy General's parking lot under police escort to collect her belongings, her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The escort officer, a woman named Chen, walked beside her without speaking. Professional. Respectful. Like escorting someone who mattered. The ER doors opened. The familiar smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hit her like a memory. The staff pretended not to watch. A few heads turned anyway. Megan kept her face forward, her breathing even, her spine straight. She'd survived worse than this. She'd just forgotten for a moment. She pulled open her locker. The worn combat boots sat exactly where she'd left them. She reached for them. Reaper. The voice was hoarse. Damaged. Megan turned. Corporal Martinez lay in the observation bed 3 sections over, his shoulder bandaged, his eyes locked on hers with the intensity of someone who'd just seen a ghost stand up and walk toward him. She stopped moving. The whole ER seemed to stop moving with her. Martinez struggled to sit up, his fall line catching, his face contorting with pain. Senior Chief Petty Officer, he gasped. Not a question. A recognition. A name he'd carried for 20 years, waiting for a face to match it. Megan's hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. She simply walked to his bedside and placed her palm against his uninjured shoulder. Don't move, Corporal. It's you. It's actually you. The ER had gone dead silent. The doors to the trauma bay opened. 2 men in dress uniforms. Navy. One wore the insignia of a commander. The other carried a manila folder sealed with red tape. They moved with the kind of precision that came from decades of operating in shadows. The commander's eyes found Megan instantly. Like they'd been looking for her forever. Senior Chief, the commander said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a statement of fact. Sir. I'm Commander Holloway, JSOC liaison. This is your file. He handed her the folder. She didn't open it. She already knew what was inside. 13 deployments. Yemen. Somalia. Hindu Kush. He paused. Let the weight of those words settle like ordnance. You extracted 12 Marines under enemy fire in Marja. Took shrapnel. Kept moving. 3 of those men aren't alive today because you quit when the pain got too much. They're alive because you didn't. Megan's jaw tightened. She still didn't open the file. The commander stepped closer. His voice dropped low enough that only she and Martinez could hear. 3 bronze stars. He placed his hand flat on the folder. 2 purple hearts. The commander's hand didn't shake. Neither did hers. And a Navy Cross for that operation in Marja. For extracting 12 Marines while critically wounded yourself. The silence stretched. No one in the ER was pretending anymore. They were staring. Openly. Completely. Martinez's eyes had filled with tears. "You saved my life twice," he whispered. That's when the smirk appeared in the corner of the room. Dr. Sterling stood against the wall, his pristine white coat still pristine, his face flushed with something that looked like panic dressed up as contempt. He watched for exactly 3 seconds. Then he moved. The security office was 40 feet away. Sterling took them in a rush, his hand already reaching for the door. But the IT technician, Rodriguez, according to his nameplate, stood in his way. Rodriguez had shoulders like a linebacker and the calm expression of someone who'd seen actual war. He'd seen actual war. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. He'd come home missing his left eye and his right leg below the knee, and he'd taken the security job because it let him sit and still be useful. "Looking for something, Doctor?" Rodriguez's voice was the same consistency as industrial concrete. "The footage from this week. I need you to delete it." Rodriguez didn't move. "Already saved it." Sterling's face went a color that didn't have a name. "You can't." "Already forwarded it." Rodriguez's tone didn't change. "State Medical Board got copies. Your board member got copies. The DoD liaison got copies. The hospital CEO got copies about 40 minutes ago when she was still at her daughter's wedding reception." Rodriguez smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "The one you called during the ceremony to try to get her to fire that nurse." Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "You interfered with patient care," Rodriguez continued, his words precise as rifle shots. "You attempted to coerce a subordinate. You fabricated complaints. You're on camera doing all of it. I know who that nurse is. I know what she did in Marja. And I know you tried to destroy her because she made you look incompetent in front of an ER full of residents." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. "So I saved the footage." By noon, Sterling's board member allies weren't taking his calls. By 3 p.m., the hospital's legal team had informed him that his actions created significant liability exposure. The external investigator he'd hired to find discrepancies in Megan's credentials had instead found discrepancies in Sterling's credentials, a medical degree from a diploma mill he'd purchased in Belize, falsified continuing education credits, and documentation showing he'd paid someone to take his board certification exam. The CEO herself escorted Sterling from the building at 5 p.m. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. His pristine white coat hung over his arm like a surrender flag. He stood in the parking lot watching through the glass doors as Megan walked past him, in the opposite direction, back into Mercy General to accept her reinstatement and her promotion to Director of Trauma Services. She didn't look at him. He didn't exist anymore. 1 week later, Megan stood in the Oval Office wearing her navy dress blues for the first time in 20 years. The uniform fit perfectly. Her hands no longer trembled as she adjusted her dress whites. The jacket hung on her frame like something she'd been born wearing. Around her neck hung the Navy Cross, 3 links of ribbon the color of deep ocean, the medal itself catching light like a captured star. The president extended his hand. Photographers captured the moment. Camera flashes like artillery rounds. Megan shook his hand with the grip of someone who'd held dying men in operating theaters and pulled screaming children from rubble. Her strength was measured and precise. Corporal Martinez stood beside her in his Army Ranger dress uniform. The worn combat boots, the one she'd rescued from a burning village 2 decades ago, the one she'd kept in her locker, now sat polished to mirror shine on his feet. He read a statement about the operator who saved him twice. His voice stayed steady until the end. Then it broke. Just slightly. Like a man letting the world see that he was human. The White House press secretary announced a new veteran transition program. Named after Megan O'Brien. The Reaper Protocol. For operators transitioning to civilian life. For people who'd learned to survive and needed to learn to live. Back in Houston, Dr. Sterling taught CPR certification courses at a community college. Minimum wage. His medical license permanently revoked. He was a cautionary tale that nobody asked for, teaching life-saving techniques to people he'd never respect because he'd lost the authority to respect anyone. Megan returned to Mercy General in her dress blues before changing back into scrubs. The staff stood as she walked through the ER. She didn't acknowledge the applause. She opened her locker, looked at the worn combat boots one final time, and placed them on a shelf in her new office, the director's office, with her name on the door in clean white letters. Rodriguez had framed a photograph of her with Martinez and hung it in the security office. Megan visited the photo and placed her hand against the glass. Rodriguez nodded. Understanding passed between them, the kind that only happened between people who'd been to the other side and come back changed. She visited her husband's grave one last time, kneeling on the grass in the Houston sunshine. The smell of fresh-cut grass and southern earth filled her lungs. "I didn't fail, Marcus," she whispered. "I just needed to remember who I was." Back in the ER, Megan stood beside a young nurse, fresh out of nursing school, hands shaking slightly. "Watch," Megan said quietly. She talked through the needle decompression procedure. Her hands moved with surgical precision. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The hiss of air escaping means you've done it right. Listen for that sound. That sound is a life you're saving. The young nurse watched with absolute focus. Megan looked directly at the camera, at you, watching this at home or in your car or on your kitchen counter. Her voice dropped. Steady. Sure. The voice of someone who'd earned the right to say exactly what she meant. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. If Megan's story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated and come back to prove yourself, hit that subscribe button. Like this video. Comment below, have you ever misjudged someone who turned out to be exactly what you needed?